My name is Joshua Meltzer. I'm a senior fellow in the Global Economy and Development program at the Brookings Institution, where I focus on international trade issues. The United States enters into trade agreements generally both for economic and security reasons. At one level, the US is such a large economy that particularly bilateral trade agreements, even the trade agreements with Canada and Mexico, only generate relatively small gains for the economy. They're also important for strategic reasons because they cement closer economic ties, they lay down the rules for development and growth going forward, and they create more stable partners, which can also often underpin a more stable security environment. Certainly in the North American context that's absolutely crucial. The United States has used NAFTA to, particularly with regards to Mexico, to sustain economic growth in Mexico, to tie Mexican production into the North American value-added chain, and to build a prosperous and increasingly democratic Mexico south of its border, which is clearly a very good economic and national security outcome for the United States. The trade deficit calculates the difference between exports and imports, and the intuitive response is that deficits are bad for the United States economy, and if only one could increase exports and reduce imports, that the US economy would actually be better off. This is wrong for a couple of reasons. One is that the difference between exports and imports is actually driven by the gap between domestic savings and needed investment, which sucks in a lot of capital from overseas, and through other macroeconomic effects, particularly on the exchange rate, drives the trade deficit. The use of imports in the US economy is also often a very positive driver of growth. If one takes the basic equation of what generates GDP, there is a point where imports are subtracted from that equation, which leads people at times to think that imports are actually a negative, where in fact imports are simply being subtracted out because imports are already being calculated in the other elements of domestic production, namely consumption, investment and government spending, and so imports are subtracted out because we're just calculating domestic production. We don't want to overstate that number. Whether or not imports are actually good or bad for US economic growth, the answer is really it depends on how imports are used, just like anything else. If they're used productively as inputs into business processes, then imports make businesses more competitive, they employ more people, they generate more wealth. There might be concern at times that imports come in and they compete unfairly with domestic production, and that's a very legitimate response for trade policy, but the idea that simply closing off imports to the US economy would be good for growth makes absolutely no sense. Trade agreements get renegotiated all the time. NAFTA is over 20 years old, so in principle there is no problem with that. One will recall that former President Obama, in fact, talked about renegotiating NAFTA in 2008, and in fact that was achieved in the context of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. In those negotiations, the United States got improved market access into Mexico and Canada, and in fact gave up almost nothing, in part because Mexico and Canada were so keen to be part of this new Trans-Pacific Partnership agreement that they were willing to make concessions to the United States. Instead of accepting the TPP outcome as an update of NAFTA, President Trump has said he wants to start all over again, but he doesn't have the TPP, so this will be a bilateral negotiation with Mexico where for the United States to get something from Mexico, even equivalent to what was gained in the TPP, the US will have to give something up. Now, the question which remains unanswered, in fact, is whether the administration is looking to even further integrate the US and Mexico and further reduce barriers and improve market access, or whether, because of the politics of the administration around trade, that we actually see a walking back of integration and a raising of tariffs and non-tariff barriers.